Canada isn't a country you just roll over. Its size is more like a continent. With Donald Trump and his allies continuing to make threats towards Canada, the real question is this: if the US pushed north, could NATO actually defend Canada, and how would such a scenario likely play out? I'm Tuomas, a former officer in the Finnish Defence Forces, and this is part 2 of October's community-voted deep dive, after we covered Greenland last week. We'll start with the order of battle: air power, naval power, ground forces, kit and readiness. Then follow the money and the realities of attempting to occupy an armed-to-the-teeth hunting nation with vast expanses of nearly untouched wilderness, as well as a border which is quite honestly one of the easiest in the world to get small sabotage teams across. As in our Greenland video, I just want to reiterate that I don't particularly see this happening, not because I don't think the current administration wants to, but down to the fact that the US population likely wouldn't allow it, and America's bases and standing worldwide, both financially and militarily, would collapse. But that doesn't mean that we can't theorize and follow the wishes of our community, so here we go. As always, to flesh out a better understanding of a potential conflict, we start with the numbers because they matter. Canada fields roughly 75,000 active personnel, supported by around 27,000 reservists, plus, as we discussed in our Greenland video, the uniquely local Arctic specialist Canadian Rangers. About 5,600 volunteers who are the permanent eyes and ears of the far north. That gives Canada a compact, professional force with deep territorial knowledge and an institutional focus on homeland defense. As the defender, Canada would likely see a massive surge in enlistment if the US were to attack, meaning that within a few months, their figures would likely double, not only with army personnel, but also with local communities taking up arms against an invasion. By contrast, the United States fields about 1.3 million active duty troops, plus a massive reserve and National Guard. The manpower gap is huge. On paper, that lets the US generate overwhelming force fast. In practice, geography, domestic politics in democratic states, and economics blunt that edge. A large slice of US strength is overseas. Roughly 206,000 personnel are stationed abroad, mostly in Japan, Germany, South Korea, Italy, and the UK. Canada, for its part, has around 3,000 deployed, mainly in the Baltics with NATO's forward presence. For Canada's generals and its Commonwealth and NATO partners, a key warning sign would likely be American forces stationed abroad, starting to regroup at home, because they're often the tip of the spear for any American operation. In equipment, the gap in scale is as big, if not larger. Canada fields roughly 80 Leopard 2 tanks, a towed artillery arm built around about 33 777 howitzers, with a further 100 or so older 105mm howitzers in reserve. Canada is also currently in the midst of a program to add some 80 to 90 self-propelled guns from European suppliers, and operates a wheeled armor fleet centered on the Canadian-built LAV family, about 550 upgraded LAV-3 and LAV-6 vehicles, plus roughly 360 armored combat support vehicles, putting the LAV-based fleet close to 900 vehicles. On top of this, Canada also operates some 1,000-plus lighter armored vehicles, articulated vehicles, and MRAPs. The United States, by contrast, fields far larger formations, roughly 1,400 Abrams tanks in its armored brigade combat teams, around 670 M109 self-propelled guns, and a towed M777 fleet measured in the high hundreds. When we add on the 400 or so HIMARS launchers, we end up at a total of well over 2,000 artillery pieces in the US Armory. On top of that, the US fields thousands of infantry fighting vehicles and wheeled combat platforms, roughly 2,400 Bradleys, and more than 4,000 Strykers, though it is important to note that a large part of the US armored inventory is in storage and would need some time to be activated. Add in Humvees, MRAPs, light armored tactical vehicles, and the whole shebang, and you're probably looking at closer to 100,000 vehicles in all US branches, though again quite large parts of this inventory is stored abroad. With that in mind, on the ground, the map still favors the defender, as there is only so much armor you can push into a country without causing massive jams, like what Russia experienced when trying to take Kyiv in 2022. Canada's forces are optimized for its own territory: mechanized infantry, mobile LAV brigades, and a compact tank force trained for sniping on its home turf in the forest and Arctic approaches, while US brigades bring mass, logistics, and long-range fires that the Canadian Army can't hope to match one-on-one. In a set-piece fair-weather clash with intact logistics and clear skies, that American mass massively favors the attacker. But Canada, with its huge country, doesn't have to give the US that fight. They can do as Ukraine, trade space for time, bleed supply lines with terrain using cheap FPV drones, make the US clear cities and take outsized casualties in the process, and turn every advance into a potential supply trap. That is the defensive logic. Any initial defense would try to blunt American advances with a few armored formations, holding choke points and demolishing crossings like the Ambassador Bridge and hundreds of other roads that connect the two countries over rivers and lakes, while much of the Canadian Army withdraws into terrain that is cheaper to defend and far harder for an occupier to sustain. An example, if you will. When the Allied armies had fought their way to the Elbe River in Germany in 1945, only 120 or so kilometers from Berlin, they had only traveled some 950 kilometers into Europe after a grueling 10 months of fighting with complete air and armored superiority in mostly farmland and cities. 950 kilometers when transposed onto Canada gets you about halfway up British Columbia, meaning that the Canadian Army would have almost unlimited territory to trade for casualties. And as we discussed earlier, Canada outside its metropolitan areas is mostly extremely dense woodland and not easily accessible remote areas. Airpower will most likely shape the opening phase, and here the numbers show a similar trend. Canada is mid-upgrade for their fighter fleet. Legacy Hornets, about 89 in service, keep flying, and they'd almost certainly focus on a withdrawal to bases far north in Canada and performing defensive counter-air operations, like Ukrainian jets do with Russia's airpower, shooting down missiles and inbound ordnance rather than trying to duel the sheer mass of US airpower. Canada has no bombers and no early warning aircraft of its own. But for ESR, it leans on roughly 14 Aurora Patrol and intelligence aircraft, and for lift it fields 5 Globemasters strategic transports alongside 17 Hercules medium lift craft. By contrast, the United States brings scale at every tier. The US Air Force fighter force alone is on the order of around 2,000 aircraft across its fleets. The US Navy adds roughly 450 more, and the US Marine Corps is on track for around 200 F-35s delivered by the end of this year, pushing the total US fighter inventory well above 2,600 across the three services. The bomber arm includes about 120 active aircraft. For airborne warning, the US Air Force keeps around 15 E-3 Sentry, while the Navy supplies the carrier-borne E-2D Hawkeye squadrons, which numbers 78 in total. And the airlift wings of the American Armed Forces are unmatched, around 500 heavy and medium airlift assets across the force, backed by a huge tanker fleet, giving Washington the ability to seize airfields and ports quickly and move forces at continental scale. That air dominance is the reason the US Armed Forces could potentially seize airfields and ports fast. It is also the reason why the first 48 to 72 hours of any North American campaign would look brutal and one-sided. If you're Canadian, you're probably thinking, well, Thomas, this all looks rather useless. But in a bit, I'll get to why a potential conflict would probably not be the kind of brutal onslaught that Pete Hegseth dreams of at night. Maritime geography only makes an occupier's job harder, and the numbers underline why. The US Navy is massive by tonnage. Reputable trackers put US fleet displacement at roughly 4 million tons of warship tonnage. By contrast, the Royal Canadian Navy's entire active fleet amounts to only a few 100,000 tons at most, using class displacements for Halifax-class frigates, Victoria-class submarines, Harry de Wolfe patrol ships, Kingston coastal vessels, and the new Protecteur Auxiliary. The RCN's total fleet displacement is on the order of 130,000 tons. Though, as we've seen in Ukraine, attacking a large nation with a massive inland territory with such assets is an entirely different proposition. Canada's small but nimble navy can easily hide inside the countless fjords and inlets of the Canadian coast and strike when needed. It's not going to try to hunt US ships on the open oceans, but we have to remember that only a few missiles, or in Ukraine's case, drone boats and old Soviet Neptune missiles, can sink entire capital ships. The Royal Canadian Navy has a mix of vessels with capable harpoon missiles and torpedoes, which could quickly duck out of a fjord and fire at American assets, meaning that in reality, the US Navy would likely need to wait for its air assets to try to hunt down the smaller Canadian fleet before moving close to Canadian territory. Now, let's return to the actual question. Should Canada just give up in such a scenario? The simple answer is no. After a few weeks of American shock and awe, with a chunk of Canadian cities and southern lands in US hands, the most difficult phase for the US would begin. On the ground, we can't understate Canada's rural gun culture. Licensed firearms ownership runs in the millions. Hunting rifles, shotguns, and a significant number of semi-automatic platforms are common across rural provinces and the territories. Hunters, trappers, indigenous communities, and remote towns all bring local knowledge, mobility assets like snowmobiles and ATVs, and a cultural familiarity with living off the land. That creates a distributed pool of potential resistance fighters and a logistical headache for any occupier trying to hold population centers while also policing the countryside. And then there's all the outside factors. Politically, the fallout would be huge. An attack by the United States on Canada would shatter NATO norms and trigger near-universal condemnation. Allies in NATO and the Commonwealth would be put to a binary choice: join the aggressor, oppose them, or fracture the alliance. The diplomatic, economic, and legal consequences would be immediate: freezing financial access, calling in on US foreign debt, which is a large part of the current $40 trillion of deficit, expelling US interests from foreign markets and bases, and quitting the US dollar as the world reserve currency. Quickly summarized, the soft power cost to the US as a superpower would be incalculable. That cascade of diplomatic fallout is a major deterrent in itself. For all the overwhelming hardware and the so-called war plans supposedly dreamed up by Pete Hegseth and his makeup team, the biggest obstacle to invading Canada sits inside the United States, its own public. Polls on the 51st state idea are brutally clear. Roughly half of Americans are outright against merging with Canada. Another big chunk say they would only even consider it if Canadians themselves begged for it. Well over 9 in 10 give either no support or only very conditional support to the idea. There is no popular mandate for a war of annexation against a friendly democracy. Then add the geography of US politics. 13 American states share a border with Canada. Most of those border states, Washington, Minnesota, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, lean or vote Democrat. Those are exactly the states whose National Guard units, ports, railheads, and air bases you would need as springboards for an invasion. Their governors and legislatures would be under huge pressure to refuse, delay, or openly resist. On top of that, a big share of active duty troops are based in blue or swing states like California and Virginia. You would be asking soldiers from those communities to fight a deeply unpopular war against a neighbor most Americans still see as an ally. That is a recipe not just for protests, but for a serious constitutional and civil military crisis. So, to answer the question of October's community post, could Canada and its allies defend Canada from the US? In the early phase, probably not. The US has air, naval, and land supremacy, plus a massive surge capability. An initial occupation of the southern parts of Canada would be likely. However, when it comes to consolidation and occupation, the advantage sits squarely with the defender: geography, local resistance, economic interdependence, and political fallout. The likely operational reality is grim for an attacker: quick initial wins, followed by a slow, costly occupation that drains resources, destroys alliances, and damages the attacker's own economy, political stability, and global standing. In short, it's more likely that there's going to be an American Civil War than an American invasion of Canada. And, in case it needs to be reiterated, Canada is widely liked by its allies, across the Pacific, the Commonwealth, and Europe alike. Together, that's well over 700 million people, with armed forces that, even if only some of them stood up to Trump, would stretch American focus far beyond Canada. I think that deep down, even the wildest MAGA strategist knows this. In case you haven't seen it yet, last week's episode where we posed the same question for Greenland is linked below in the description. As always, I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and if you want to suggest a topic for November's community video, we've put up a new community voting post in the community tab, so get voting and we'll see what we'll cover next month. Until next time, have a good weekend.